dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today I'm going to revisit an article from 2021 from the blog, and it's a topic that I never get tired of covering this. I did a video recently that showed that the number of people who are defining themselves specifically and only as preto, which in Portuguese means black, is now standing at about 10% in Brazil. That's an incredible jump. All the years that going back 23 years ago, when I first started studying all things Brazilian, that number usually was somewhere between 5 and 6%. And that number is almost doubled since the year about 2000, when I started studying things about race in Brazil. Now, mind you, I always stand behind the idea that there are more than 10% of Brazilians are black, but I also can't buy into the idea that 56% of Brazilians are black. I know I keep talking about this topic, but I've always asked, well, people looking at this from the outside, how can there be such a wide disparity of some people saying the country's 10% black, while others will insist that Brazil is a black majority country with about 56% of 215 million Brazilians being black, which would make it, I don't know, what is that, like 115, 120 million people. And after, agreeing with that for a number of years, I finally had to come to my own conclusion that, okay, I know that there are more than 21 or 22 million black Brazilians, but I also know that there aren't 120 million black Brazilians. Quite honestly, I've said this again and again, we'll really never really know how many black folks there are in Brazil, because nobody can really agree on what it means to be black. If you only want to go by those who define themselves as pretos, then it would be 10%. If you combine pretos plus the brown or mixed category, then it would be about 56%, or like I said, somewhere between 110 and 120 million black people, which I also don't think is true. But then if you really categorize everybody in Brazil who has some degree of mixed race, that'd probably be about 90% of the country. So where's the cutoff point for what starts, where blackness ends, mixed race begins, and white, picks up? Or rather, where does blackness end and mixed race and whiteness begin? Where does whiteness cut off before persons are considered either pardo or preto, meaning brown or black? It's hard to say. And I'm willing to acknowledge that. If I was a betting man, I would say that Brazil is probably somewhere between 25 and 33% black. That's just how I would see it, because a large percentage of those people who call themselves pardos or brown are mixtures of all types. There have been a number of people who have been advocating for Brazilians of indigenous ancestries to start claiming themselves as indigenous people, rather than just being lumped in the pardo category. So the point is, some pardos are considered black, but then you have some who are of Indian or indigenous ancestry. What do you do with them? So where I'm leaning today is that after many years of organizing behind racial identity, I think it's time for persons in the pardo category, the brown or mixed category, who do see themselves as black, to leave the pardo category and just simply identify themselves as preto or black. That's how I see it. That's the only way that I think this thing can be resolved. And that doesn't even necessarily mean that by defining yourself black, that you're not also of mixed race. If you believe some of the DNA studies that come out of Brazil, the entire population is, basically mixed. It's just that some people look a little blacker, some people look a little whiter, some people look mixed, leaning towards the white side, look mixed, leaning towards the Indian side, look mixed, more predominantly to the black side. So this is why I say I don't think there'll ever be a complete consensus on how many black people there are in Brazil. But increasingly what we're seeing, I did a video a couple of days ago, might have been last week, where it showed, again, the population that defines itself as specifically black now is now at about 10%. And that those numbers are growing because of situations like the one I'm going to cover today. People who for years didn't see themselves as black. They came from families where race was never discussed. They come from families that tell them, you no, you're not black. You're mestizo, you're pardo, you're Brazilian. And a lot of families, because of the stigma associated with blackness in a racist country like Brazil, people will run away from being black. Um, and then a lot of these people will just get a slap in the face one day when somebody calls them a racist term. You know, if somebody calls them a neguinho or a negrinha or a criollo or something like that. And these people go all their lives not believing they're black until somebody throws a racial insult in their face and be just like, well, if I'm not black, why did you call me that? You know what I mean? If I'm not black, why did you refer to me as macaco or monkey? This is the term that Brazilians most like to insult black people with, right? And it starts to make people start to question what their identity is. And this is something that I've always said. Um, I've had to move my positions in terms of the race question because having several conversations with people over the years saying like, look, all mixed people are not of African ancestry. Some of them are primarily of indigenous ancestry. What do you do with those people? You can't just claim them as black. So I've had to move my position. But another thing for people who advocate, pardos are just their own category. There's been too many stories over the years of Brazil will have you believe that only dark-skinned black people should be considered black in Brazil, and that's just not the case. I see story after story. Some of them are on the blog of lighter skinned people, light brown or just medium brown people who were called with one of these racial slurs. So then if you advocate the idea that persons of whatever mixed race just belong in the partial category, how do you argue that when somebody gets insulted with a term that is generally reserved to black people? All right. Um, some people come into this racial identity in other ways. There's a few other stories that I might have here that I might go through. Increasingly, some people are demanding their right to define themselves as black. This article I've covered, I'm not parda, brown or mixed. I'm black and I have a right to this identity. This is an article by this young lady right here. I forget her name. I covered this particular story. It's Larissa Carvalho, and that was her own journey through becoming black. Again, specifically preto or black people declaring themselves preto in the state of Bahia, which is considered to be like a state with a large black population. This other article says our light skinned blackness will not be negotiated, and this is by this writer named Bianca Santana, and she wrote a book called, When I Discovered I Was Black. Let me see if I can find that here. So this was her book, Quando me descobri negra, meaning when I discovered I was black, right? So her identity and transition. What made me transition my own thoughts on just how many black people there might be in Brazil is this piece right here, where it says, for the first time in Brazil, blacks are the majority in public universities. And I just thought that was a bit of an exaggeration. And I still look at it that way because the black social movement, the Movimento Negro in Brazil, contradicts itself when they exclude certain people from being able to get into college through the quota system for black and brown people. When they say certain people are not black or brown and you belong in the white category, but then they want to use those same people and count them as part of the black population to say Brazil has 120 million black people. So this is what really started making me move my position a little bit more on this topic. Some people say, hey, why do we categorize ourselves according to race? I think that's going a little bit too far because, it is what it is. It gets exhausting to me when I hear people consistently say, oh, I don't see people as black, white, or black, white, or black, white, green, purple, or orange. And I understand what these people are saying, but realistically, we don't have purple, blue, red, and orange people. But in the minds of people around the world, this race category is something that still functions in the mind. So it's ridiculous to try to ignore that somebody belongs to a certain group. What is the problem with ignoring that, So this is something that I'm curious about. I always like to see people's transition because in the United States, you generally know, it's an open discussion in your home, what you are. But a lot of Brazilians didn't get that in the home. So this is why they can be 20, 25, 30, in some cases 67 years old and just discovering that they're black. This is a story from a musician. She says, what does it say here? I discovered myself black when she was called to be a model in a makeup course. So this woman is the daughter of a white mother and a black father. The father was apparently not part of her life when she was growing up. And she says that she went 2 decades without understanding that she is black. So this is the woman right here. She discovered she was black only after she was 25. So let me see what her story says. She says here, okay, she's 35. And she says I guess the partner, the friend of a friend, uh was doing a makeup course, and she wanted to do an afro style in somebody's hair for a black woman who was getting married, and she invited Lua Bernardo, this bass player, to be a model. And this was when she says the coin dropped, or the light went off in her head, and it started to hit her that she was a black woman. So this is something that you hear in Brazil all the time. People, really? You spent years not knowing you were black, and then all of a sudden you come into this. Now, you adapt to this new identity. So this is a similar story. There's so many of them that I could cover. Today's story. I'm 32 years old, but I've only been black for 5. Through her children and understanding of her own features, a consultant transitions into blackness. Okay. This is from January of 2021. This is the young lady whose story I'm talking about today. I'm going to get into this right now. So I like to post stories like the one below from time to time to remind readers of what racial identity is like in a country like Brazil. As the country has convinced generations of its citizens to accept that being black is such a terrible thing and should be avoided at all costs, it is one of the main reasons we can never really know how many black people there are in Brazil. My own view has changed on this issue, and I can no longer support the idea that there are more than 100 million black people in Brazil. As I've pointed out in numerous posts, for years I supported the criteria of the Movimento Negro, the Black movement, that argued that Brazil's population is the total of pretos y pardos, meaning blacks and browns, or mixed if you prefer, together. But after having visited several states and seeing various cities in these states, as well as living nearly a decade in Sao Paulo, I can honestly say that all pardos are not black. There is a percentage of the Pardo population that could be considered black, but probably not the majority. And since Pardos make up about 85% of the black category, okay, look at what the stats we're seeing in 2021. We're almost 17 million people who identify themselves as just black versus 97.5 million who consider themselves Pardos, mixed, or brown. And as we are pretty sure all pretos are black, and that an undefined percentage of pardos could be reasonably considered black, the true number of black Brazilians would depend more on how many pardos would be judged as black. Based on a number of studies, I tend to believe that perhaps 25% of pardos could be considered black. I know that many black Brazilians would scoff at my assessment, but I would argue that they know this is true. We see this every time black activists judge this or that pardo as not being black enough, or in fact white, to enter a university through the affirmative action system. And there have been a lot of pardos that black Brazilian activists have had disqualified from the quota system for precisely this reason. This proves my point. So this harks back to the article that I was just talking about, right? This is a discussion that continues to go on. The article is saying, blacks are the majority in public university in Brazil for the first time. Same thing here. For the first time, blacks are the majority in public universities. All of these stories broke, whatever year that was. It was probably 2021. And I was just talking about, okay, well, how can we really say that? It's when people can decide, anybody can self-define themselves as black, white, brown, whatever they want to be. But we can never fully agree on what the criteria of what blackness means. So that's why I said, I had to change my position on this after years of saying, okay, for me, blacks and browns just constitute the black population in Brazil. I've had to change my position on that. Okay. Anyway, another reason that it is so difficult to determine just how Black Brazil really is the fact that perhaps millions of people who some may see as Black may actually define themselves as Pardo or even Branco, meaning white. In recent years, the numbers and percentages of Pretos have been steadily rising, and this is not simply due to an increased birth rate, but rather hundreds of thousands of people, after going through a self-examination of racial identity, have come to see themselves as Black after years of defining themselves in other color categories. So this is the story of Daisy Rodriguez, and hers is just one of probably millions of examples. So, name of her story. I'm 32 years old, but I've only been Black for 5 years. So, this is a story by Daisy Rodriguez in testimony to Natalia Geraldo. So, she's telling her story to somebody else. Okay, she's a CEO of a company called Ubuntu Consultoria, right? I'm 32 years old and the mother of 3 children. Their father is from the African continent, from Guinea-Bissau. I am from Recife, which is the capital city of the northeastern state of Pernambuco. From 5 years ago, I started to build an identity linked to my Blackness. I, who am considered or who are part of the so-called Pardus, recognize myself as a lighter skinned Black, as the fruit of a miscegenation that is not positive. It happened first because of the rape of Black and indigenous women. Then there was a policy of the state of whitening of the Brazilian population, in which the idea was to make it completely white. This is something I've covered over and over. The Brazilian state's theory, the promotion of mixing of the races until they could eventually come to a white population by mixing out Black people. This would be the solution to the underdevelopment of the country. This was in the elite view. The elite view said that Brazil can never be taken seriously on the world stage with such a large Black mixed population. I am the result of this process that didn't work out, which goes through my family tree of Black grandparents. So she's saying how, her family, just like many families, went through this programming of whitening the population. As you can see, she considers herself Black today, but clearly she has fair skin. But now she realizes this. She understands the politics of what's called embranquecimento, or whitening. I began to talk about the racial issue with motherhood. Before, I was the woman of the color of jambu, morena, but I didn't recognize myself as a Black woman. So people use these terms like jambu, like it's a color of a fruit, or morena, which is it's a catch-all term phrase. Anybody can be a morena in Brazil unless you have blonde or red hair, right? I've said this, I had to repeat this all the time because it's not part of American culture, or, countries that, where these terms are more common in Latin America. But a morena can be anybody in Brazil, again, who's not red or blonde, have blonde or red hair. A morena can be a white person with dark hair, a mixed person. It could be a dark-skinned Black person. I've seen morena used in many different ways in Brazil, and it can be a confusing term. She continues. When my eldest son was 7, I'm assuming that's this kid right here, he began to suffer racial discrimination at school. They said, your hair is hard, your nose is ugly. Now in Brazil, they say your hair is hard. It's like, cabelo duro, they say, hard hair. It's basically saying somebody's hair is bad, your hair is too hard. Obviously in African American community, we're familiar with that. The first offense the Black child suffers is about aesthetics. Pierre brought this demand home, and I couldn't explain why we Brazilians are not prepared to talk about it with our families at school. And I was part of that ignorance. That's when I started to revisit myself. When we claim this place of the light-skinned Black, we are not claiming the pain that dark-skinned Blacks suffer. It's easier for an offense like monkey to be directed at a negro de pele retinta, meaning a dark-skinned Black. So it's easier for an offensive term like monkey to be directed at a dark-skinned Black man than at me, a light-skinned Black woman. Even though I've seen light-skinned Black women be defined as, ugly Black, or I've seen light-skinned Black women being called negrinho or macaco, meaning monkey. So having light skin doesn't necessarily shield you from racial insults, even though you might hear these racial insults perhaps less than a darker skinned, more obvious Black person. or obvious, well, we'll say uh, the phenotype that people more often associate with blackness, darker skin, a tighter curl in the hair. So I'm saying I've seen light skinned people get caught with these racial insults. So it's not like it does not happen. We hear that we have privileges, but we don't. We have social advantages because only whiteness has privileges. We suffer racial discrimination in a much less violent way in some situations. But in the statistics, pretos, meaning blacks, and pardos, meaning browns, both in the numbers of unemployment and police violence. So what she's saying here is that, okay, some people say that people who are not darker skinned blacks might experience racism in a more subtle manner. And sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. In a lot of articles on the blog, I specifically point out, look at this person has light skin, but still they were called a monkey, they were still called a negrina, you know. So it doesn't necessarily mean that's true, that they're going to suffer, just completely suffer, racism, or just, not suffer with racism. Um, I do say that it can be more subtle with lighter skinned people, but that's not always the case. I've got several stories that show that. So she's saying that among blacks and browns, the numbers of unemployment and blacks and browns being victims of police violence shows that a lot of people argue that, pardos actually suffer more discrimination in Brazil than pretos. Just really depends on how you look at it and which stats you're looking at. So she says, I saw the blackness of my children in me. They were my trigger. And it's hard not to start this process with aesthetics because it's what makes light skinned blacks try to follow the imposed social standard and try to pass themselves off as white. Heard that hundreds of times. I did a progressiva. I'll get into that in a minute. I did a progressiva in my hair since I was 13 years old. Before I used to relax it. It was a product that left a strong smell to the point of getting on the bus and being embarrassed because nobody wanted to sit next to me. Not to mention that it would hurt my scalp. As the hair didn't straighten totally, I had to brush it. And if I was in the rain, it would curl up. So let me go into this. A lot of people who do hair, if you've worked in a hair salon and you've heard this Brazilian keratin treatment, in Brazil, they call it a progressiva. It's a popular chemical treatment for straightening hair. The author here explains three different processes of attaining straight hair: the progressiva, or the Brazilian keratin treatment, the relaxer, and then the process of blow drying the hair while using a brush to straighten it out. She continues, we straighten out of a question of security to feel accepted. And it has an effect of a violent mental health. You spend your whole life trying to deny your identity. I can't disagree with that. But two of the major physical attributes that connect you to your African ancestry is the skin color and the hair texture. So one could argue that if you spend all your life trying to straighten your hair out because you don't want people to, you think the curl is it's a negative attribute of your physical appearance, or you don't feel like you're accepted in society if you have kinky curly hair, then you spend your whole life straightening up your hair. So which in essence, what she's saying is that you're trying to deny your identity. Okay. With the birth of my daughter, Sophie, now 3 years old, I still had to understand that I'm not her aesthetic reference, and that was very strong. She grabs my hair and it falls because it's curly. Hers, no. So I say it's a queen's crown, and I look for more references for her. So I appreciate what she's saying here. What she's saying is that she recognizes the differences between herself and her daughter. Her daughter she looks like she's a couple shades darker than her, and she might have a looser curl in her hair. So as she married a man from the African continent, her kids are darker than her, of course, but she still wants to build, a point of reference for her kids, for particularly her daughter, seeing that she's lighter skinned and she perhaps have a looser curl than her hair, and she still wants her daughter to identify with her blackness. We saw this story recently in a video that I did maybe a couple of weeks ago. In that case, the black woman had a child with a phenotypically, we'll say Brazilian white, the guy she married, and then her daughter came out fair skinned, and she was worried that her daughter would not connect with a black identity. And I'm like, well, you chose to marry a white guy or off white guy. it's going to be difficult for you to impose a black identity on a child who doesn't have as clearly African features as you do. Okay. So she says here she's looking for more references for her daughter. Besides, there's the question of lipstick. I don't wear a dark color on my mouth red because it left my lip in evidence and bigger. And I always love red. One day I thought, you know what? And I started to wear red lipstick. Today I'm recognized for it. Okay, so that's what she's talking about in the picture. You see she's wearing a bright red lipstick. For years she avoided doing that. Continuing. When I was in the office of a college, I created the Ubuntu course through an edict to talk to the students about racial issues, present documentaries, and make conversation circles. In 2018, I submitted this project to a social project incubator. And at the end of 2019, I opened Ubuntu or Consultura, a consultoria to work with companies on this issue. Besides consulting, we give racial re-education courses. Now, the Ubuntu is something I believe is coming from the South African language. I forget what this means, but a lot of people started using this term Ubuntu. It's like, I don't think, let me not repeat, because I think it's something like I am because we are, or something like that. But you find this term Ubuntu, this phrase, this word popping up in a lot of Brazilians connected with this term. Okay. So you see this woman, I don't know if it's her consulting company or somebody else's, but they chose this name, Ubuntu. Have to look up and see what that means. It's been years. I've heard this term so many times. I should be able to remember what it means, but don't quote me on that. I have to look that term up. Okay, for this, I have a construction of knowledge. I can't talk about racism as a dark-skinned Black person suffers, but I talk about my process. Besides, I am the mother of Black children. I occupy this space and nobody can take it away from me. Anyone who's going through recognizing themselves as Black needs to understand first that being Black is not tied to pain. It doesn't mean that they need to go through discrimination for being Black. And people don't necessarily have the same path. So I also recommend trying to read Black authors such as Djamila Ribeiro, Abdias do Nascimento, Adilson Moreira, Silvio Almeida, Joyce Birth. They have accessible readings that talk about it. I think all of these people I've featured on the blog at one time or another. Let me see. Djamila Ribeiro is the feminist philosopher. Abdias do Nascimento, who passed away in 2011 at the age of 97. He's probably the most recognized Black Afro-Brazilian civil rights leader. He passed away in 2011. Adilson Moreira and Silvio Almeida. These are both Black men, and I think they both work the race issue through, I think they may be professors or lawyers, and they talk about the race issue in their own particular areas of specialty. Joyce Birth, I forget what she is. She may be an architect, but she also speaks a lot about Black issues on the internet. It's necessary to recognize how miscegenation was done in Brazil and revisit the family tree. Of course, in Brazil, you are not Black just because you have a Black grandfather or great grandfather, but it is important that you recognize the ancestry. This is a good point that she made. I might have a video on this from a couple of months ago, because why she's saying that is that for years, there have been white Brazilians who know that they have African ancestry, but they have steadfastly denied that they could be Black. And I get that. I'm not, people have accused me, but I've never been somebody who believes in this, the one drop rule. Okay. But when you see people's families go through this transition from being very dark skinned Black to almost white, now, and those same people who might have a great grandfather, a Black grandfather or Black grandmother, and they pass their whole lives as being Black. But as soon as there's quotas on the table, many of these people will start defining themselves as Pardus or even Black. Says, look, I got a Black grandmother. I should have quotas, access to quotas. And it's always been this thing to me. All those years you didn't want to be defined as Black. Like, having a Black grandfather doesn't make me Black, but all of a sudden quotas on the table. Now you want to claim that Black identity. So, this is what's tripped out about Brazil. It's like, on the one hand, they want to have their own racial scheme and says, no, in Brazil, you can be white even if you have African or indigenous ancestry. But then they go to countries outside of Brazil, and they come to see that people see them in a different way. So which way is Brazil going to go? Are you going to just define yourself according to Brazilian terms, or is the rest of the world going to make you see like, well, how you see yourself in your country may not apply in another country? There's a whole global thing going on here. This helps to construct your identity and understand how you are seen in society today, which is something that I was already talking about. Is one thing that people define themselves as white, brown, or black, and then it's another thing how other people see you. For you, which classification is stronger for the person, the self-identity or how society sees that person. If I wanted to go out into the world today and I tell people, oh, I'm mixed or I'm white in my mind, and that's what I'm saying, or you got this whole thing, well, I identify as such and such. So okay, if I leave my house tomorrow and I start telling people that I'm white, okay, maybe nobody's gonna say nothing to me, but they're gonna be in the back of their minds like, this dude is crazy. How I see myself versus how other people see me. And oftentimes, particularly in the job market or whatever, I think that how other people see you is going to be a stronger indication of who you are, particularly physical, than how you might see yourself. And I think this applies more when we're talking about the quote unquote mixed race category. I know there's a lot of Brazilians who've grown up their whole lives just identify themselves as Brasileiros, Brazilians, or just Pardos or mixed race. They come to the United States and people don't necessarily see them that way. They might be classified as black. So, which side do you roll with? So she says, today I call myself a black woman, but I mean that I wouldn't enter a competition for racial quotas, for example, because I think it is made for those who suffer discrimination in a more violent way. And I had a different economic and social access. I had the opportunity that most don't have. So it's intriguing how this woman sees herself. She sees herself as black. It took her, I think she said 20 some years to come to accepting a black identity. But even in coming into a black identity, she realizes that within the black category, she has a certain privilege because having a lighter skin might open up doors that may not open to a person who's darker skin. So she feels like, well, yeah, I am black. I have to identify myself as a black woman, but I don't deserve to have quotas in the same way as a person who's darker than me because they probably suffer from a more violent form of racist discrimination. So anyway, just remember there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Brazilians who go through this identity process, just like Daisy. Her name is Daisy Rodrigues. Some people never come to a black identity, and Brazil, from what I've seen, it seems like people, I was talking about this with a friend of mine who lives in Salvador a few days ago, and it just strikes me that a lot of Brazilians live under this type of deception. It's like a lot of white Brazilians know they have mixed blood. They know they have, indigenous European and in some cases African DNA, but they'll classify themselves as white, knowing that they're mixed race, right? You have people who may be mixed race or brown, and people see them clearly as black, but they don't want the black identity, right? You have situations where people will accept somebody who's maybe light skinned but has African features, and they'll accept them into the white group. They'll do that. So then that person continues to go on thinking that they're white until they run into what I call their N-word moment, where somebody throws something in their face and suddenly they're at the age of 25, 35, 40 or whatever, they come to have to look at themselves in the mirror. It's like, dang, am I really white? Then why would that person say that to me? Anyway, let me end this video here. Of course, there's going to be several more of where this one came from because it's such an important topic, this question of identity and classification. So I'm going to end the video here. I'm going to ask that if you like this video, do subscribe, giving me a like for this video. Consider subscribing to the channel, share this video, comment on this video. It's all good for the YouTube algorithms to grow this channel. Click on the notification bell so that you become aware. You'll get videos, recommended to you when I put up a new video. And with that said, I'm going to end this here and invite you all to come out and check my next video out.